So it is now July 2020. We are still, at least in the US, in the midst of the coronavirus or COVID-19 outbreak, and it doesn't seem to be getting better. The number of cases per day is increasing by, I think the last I saw was about 100,000 cases per day. Fortunately, the death rate seems to have declined. So what we have is like an increase in cases, but a decrease in deaths, right? And this here is obviously a good thing. This obviously here is a bad thing. So what it seems like to me, and this is based on very little reading on my part, but it seems to be the case that while cases are increasing, the death rate is decreasing. That suggests one of two things: either we've gotten better at treating this outbreak or treating people who have COVID, or COVID has kind of worked its way through sort of the more vulnerable population and is now being spread among the less vulnerable. So the younger, the healthier crowd that does not have pre-existing conditions or other types of problems that might put them in the high risk category. Okay, so yes, cases are going up, deaths are going down. Sort of a mixed result. But what I want to do is see if we can use economics to try to illustrate some interesting things in our response to it. Okay, now coronavirus and this pandemic is going to go down as perhaps the single most interesting topic in all of economic history, at least today, or at least as it stands today in economic history. And it is going to require a massive rethinking of a lot of how we deal with things. Because on the surface, coronavirus and the resulting economic recession, depression, whatever you want to call it, fits sort of the standard view of what a recession is. And yet, the tools that we have to sort of combat or to reduce or mitigate a recession are kind of the exact opposite of what we want to do. Okay, and so this is where it gets kind of interesting. So, those of you who have taken economics, or if you've watched my Principles of Macro course, and I'll put some links to some relevant videos in the description below, we have sort of this aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, right? And here we go. This is sort of what oops, I did it wrong myself. That's embarrassing. This would be GDP and this would be the price level. Okay. And we have sort of this macro equilibrium right here. Okay. And in this, I'll put some ones down there so we can sort of shift some curves around a little bit. And so what we saw when coronavirus, first broke out and the quarantines all started, well, the quarantine says, hey, you guys, you people, you're not really allowed to go out and buy stuff. And so that should shift the aggregate demand curve. Okay, so that'll reduce aggregate demand, shift it to the left. Okay, and we could argue that there might have also been a decrease in the short run aggregate supply as well. All right, because people weren't allowed to actually go to work, or we were unable to produce as much stuff as we typically could. Right, so the short run aggregate supply curve might have moved to the left a little bit, and I think we're now even seeing perhaps even a slight decrease in the long run aggregate supply curve, moving that to the left as well. So that would kind of go like this. I don't know. I'm not convinced that that curve is moving a whole lot, so I'm going to ignore it for right now. And so what we've got is a situation where our new equilibrium or short run equilibrium is about right there. Okay, now I've drawn it such that the price level has generally stayed about the same. I think that's pretty true. I haven't seen prices really decreasing across the board anywhere. The gas station is an obvious example where prices have come down, but they're starting to come back up. But what you've got is, if this is our long run potential GDP, well, this right here would be our short run GDP. So this is where we are today. Okay. And so this, as any student who's taken principles of macroeconomics could tell you, this is the standard sort of picture of a recession. The short run equilibrium point right here lies to the left of the long run equilibrium point right here. And so output is below potential GDP. Okay, and the standard solution is to engage in some sort of expansionary policy, right? So we just call this expansionary policy. It could be monetary policy or fiscal policy, either one. Okay, monetary policy is done by the Federal Reserve, and it basically says, hey, we can inject new money, we can lower the Fed funds rate or the target interest rate, and doing so will actually result in a increase in aggregate demand. So the idea is that we're going to shift aggregate demand, to the right. Okay. Expansionary fiscal policy, this would be like increasing spending at the federal level or perhaps lowering taxes. Okay, and that should also result in an increase in aggregate demand as well. And we can do both, we can do one or the other. It doesn't really matter what the mix is, at least in this framework. The idea is that we're going to increase aggregate demand. Whoops. Okay, and that's the goal, right? This is the goal of expansionary monetary and expansionary fiscal policy, is to increase aggregate demand. And so in theory, right, in practice is a whole different set of problems and insights that are relevant. But at least in theory, this could work, right? You basically say, you recognize that you are in a recession, and you instead of just kind of letting the recession run its course, you instead actually increase aggregate demand, with the goal being to get back to, something like this point here, where all three lines are intersecting, the economy is back at its potential GDP, and we're at full employment. Now that's where things get kind of interesting. So the goal of all these expansionary policies is to get back to full employment. But here's kind of the issue. If we get back to full employment, where everybody's going back to work, or all the people who were previously working prior to this outbreak, if all of them go back to work, then we're not exactly, we could say the problem, we're not exactly adhering to social distancing, right? Social distancing would go out the window, right? Anyone who has gone to work or went to work in January or February or before, I'm willing to bet that you were not 6 feet apart from your coworkers, right? And so the issue here is that when social distancing is not enforced or not recognized or not practiced, right? Well, the spread of COVID-19 actually increases, right? So we could say that part of why there are more cases in the US every day, and why the growth rate of new cases per day has been so high, is in part due to us going back to work, right? And if you're back at work, you might not be practicing all of the best practices that you need to. Maybe you don't wash your hands as frequently as you ought to. Perhaps you take off your mask once you get to your desk, right? Maybe you clear your throat, perhaps just like that kind of thing. And if you happen to have coronavirus and be asymptomatic, well, you've just spread the virus all over all the surfaces that you looked at, and perhaps even in the air, thus risking contamination of your entire office. Okay. And so the interesting thing that is going to require a lot of rethinking about macroeconomics is, how do you sort of reduce the pains of a recession? Because remember this picture here, where we have, a short run equilibrium to the left of the long run aggregate supply curve, right? This picture right here, well, this represents real economic hardship that people are actually feeling. And we, being like the US citizens or the US federal government, we want to reduce people's suffering. That's the goal, right? You don't want your citizens to be suffering needlessly. And so you got to find a way to sort of help this, right? Especially in a world where the most households in the US are something like one or two missed paychecks away from being homeless, right? That's a really big problem. How do you actually solve that? Now, you could say maybe you put a moratorium on rent or on mortgage payments, but then you've got the landlords who are now missing paychecks. You've got the banks that are now missing their payments that they use to fuel investment. Um, and so there's all sorts of downstream effects. And this is going to be one of the most studied periods in all of world history by economic historians for a very, very long time. And frankly, while this period is not fun, I personally look forward to all of the new insights and tools and developments and theories and practices that come out of this because we've never faced anything quite like this. And it will require a massive rethinking of a lot of the tools of macroeconomics.